At this point, I'm just going to throw everything into the public domain. Why not? It's not like I'm doing anything with them. In a world not much different than our own, I created a type of metaphysical parasite that feeds on misfortune and negativity. Nobody can really see these things by themselves, but they're always there, watching and hunting for anybody having a bad day, to put it lightly. They're drawn in by strong negative emotions and by tragedy. This is because in order to feed themselves fully, they need a host to act as a sort of digestive tract for feelings. The parasitic entity also can't do anything on its own, so it kind of needs a host if it wants to actively create its own food source. These entities, for lack of a better word, are only visible when they're attempting to inhabit a host. They manifest as little black clouds of mist, an intangible thing that's only seen for a little bit. Now, they don't just enter people whenever they like, because that's really difficult and counterproductive for the parasite itself. They much prefer to be let inside. So, how does a wispy mist parasite convince a human to become its host? Great question. Each entity has its own personality, and they can communicate very well. If one of these things decides it wants you as a host, it will tell you basically whatever it has to in order to be let in. They don't always lie directly, but they prey on the human desire to escape pain and suffering. They'll most often say something like, "I can help you make your problems go away," or "You can use me to fix your life." Things of that nature. If the person drops their guard and feels like they want it, the entity will sense this and inhabit them, regardless of whether or not the person actually says anything. They enter through the nose and mouth and become permanent residents within the host's mind. It integrates itself within the host's consciousness, which means that now the entity and the person share a thought space. This is where it goes from weird to bad. To make this parasitic relationship seem like a good thing, the entity will grant the host a unique, often specific power that serves two purposes. The first is to allow the host to better accomplish what they want, usually some form of revenge or retribution. The second is to more effectively trigger the entity's favorite negative emotion. These abilities lie dormant unless the host allows the entity to surface. This part is a bit hard to describe, but imagine that the host's mind and the entity are like two circles that occupy the same room, which is the host. They are separate, but when the entity surfaces, the circles start to overlap, kind of like a Venn diagram. The entity merges further with the host consciousness, which causes some very distinct changes. Well, aside from whatever ability they offer. I drew this amazing diagram to show the visual change that occurs. As you can see, the first panel is just the person's face. The second panel is the black mist of the entity shrouding the person's real face. And the third panel is the entity showing its own face instead. Each entity has a unique assortment of shapes that make a sort of mockery of a face. This one is just my example, so you could use any shapes or colors that you want to design the entity's appearance. I like to think that the shapes are the expression of the entity's personality, while the color is a reflection of the host. But that's just me. The other most notable change is to the host's voice. A second, highly distorted version of the person's voice can be heard underneath their own voice. It's like an echo of added texture. If I pull out some of my epic sound design skills, it might sound something like this. Aside from what's obvious, there's also the effects of what happens when the entity and the host are merged more closely together. This overlap of consciousness means that the entity's desires bleed into the host a little, and the host's reluctance begins to influence the entity. This is obviously not good, because if the host is too reluctant, then the entity won't be able to push them into creating negative emotions for them to feed on. The entity accounts for this through good old-fashioned psychological manipulation. They'll try to isolate the host, make them feel like the only solution is to listen to the parasite inside them, and generally attempt to erode any defenses the host has. The entity will only allow themselves to surface if they believe the host would be capable of what they want them to do. What happens after surfacing depends on the specific entity in question. Since they have personalities, they each have a certain emotion or a range of emotions that they prefer to feed on. Some prefer fear, so they might pressure the host into terrorizing other people. Some like grief, so they'd pressure the host into surrounding themselves with other grieving people, whatever that actually looks like. Some prefer anger, so they'd pressure the host into provoking others. Maybe all the entity wants is for the host to go to a local bar every so often and hang out near the depressed alcoholics. It can be anything, really, but the first step is often guiding the host into solving the most pressing issues in their life through whatever means necessary. This tends to be revenge of some sort, but the act of helping the host like this builds a sense of trust. If the host feels like they can trust the parasitic entity, then they're more open to anything else the entity wants them to do. You might wonder why the entity wouldn't just leave if the host refuses. Well, this is because they can't. Once they connect themselves to a host, they're stuck there until the host is dead. Occupying the same thought space as the host means trapping themselves inside the host's body. This is why entities can be very picky about who they try to inhabit and why they wait until people basically hit rock bottom. The emotional instability of that person's lowest point is what makes them easier for the entity to manipulate. Highly diabolical, of course. Once the entity has their metaphorical hooks in the host, they usually push them further and further down the path of psychological erosion. It essentially degrades the person's morality through escalation and turns them into willing participants. And it just kind of continues until the host dies somehow. That's a lot of information, so I created some specific examples of these parasitic entities that I have crafted beautiful concept drawings of. This first one is called Jaws. Now, I should explain that these things don't give themselves names. They just tend to adopt names they like that people give them. They don't really care for names, but they understand that people need names for things. Anyway, Jaws is an entity that seeks out people who experience intense hatred and are near death. It has a preference for people who have been horribly attacked, and in those brief moments before death claims them, it whispers about justice and retribution against the person's attacker, or attackers. Once it's inside, it bypasses the usual manipulation period and tries to surface immediately. If it's allowed to, it will cause the host body to rapidly regenerate, which can undo any mortal wounds they've suffered. The physical alterations will continue, and the host's arms will transform into grotesque weapons made of their own flesh and bone. Now, because Jaws is extremely deranged, even by parasitic entity standards, this bleeds into the host's decision-making when it surfaces. The host may be thinking of justice, but what that actually means becomes warped by the homicidal tendencies that Jaws embodies. It feeds off of fear, and everything about it is meant to cause as much fear as possible in the brief moments where people can see and feel their own death approaching. As time goes on, Jaws will rely less and less on the idea of justice or fairness, and start claiming that humanity as a whole is evil and should be eradicated. It basically tries to turn its host into an agent of worldwide rebirth, which is the delusion that it is found to be most effective. Now, this one is called Dawn. In comparison, this one is a bit more tame, but it's still pretty horrific in its own right. It primarily seeks out people who are mourning or grieving the loss of a loved one and are unwilling or unable to let go. It whispers promises of being able to speak to the dead, and it offers proper closure. And once somebody lets it in, it'll stall and say it needs time to contact somebody who's already passed on. You see, dawn will come through the host's mind, piecing memories together and formulating an understanding of the person that the host wishes to speak to. Then it will mimic them inside of the person's thoughts and act as if they've been connected together. This is a lie, of course, but even if the host doesn't believe it, it'll start using the host's memories against them to leverage belief. Once this fake connection is established, dawn will then offer the host the ability to speak to the dead, which is another lie. The actual ability that it possesses is the ability to probe the memories of people who allow it to. When surfaced, if the host makes any type of physical contact with someone, dawn can also go through the mind of the other person. This allows it to make up fake messages from the dead based off of those memories. It basically pretends to be psychic, and it will do this until the host runs into an ideal secondary victim who believes these messages without question. Dawn takes great care to manipulate the host and the secondary victim into performing an escalating series of rituals that ultimately do nothing except erode the sensibilities of the two people. It'll drive them to do many horrible things in order to stay in contact or bring back the lost loved ones it's pretending to be. Eventually, it'll tell the host that the secondary victim needs to be sacrificed, because you need to trade a life to get a life back, according to it. Once that's done, it'll reveal to the host that everything was a lie, and then usually mock them. This crushing weight of the truth and the total loss of hope is what dawn feeds on. It will continue to torment the host until they are totally broken and will do whatever it wants, or they end the nightmare themselves. Good lord, okay. After that one, I decided to make something lighter in tone. Now this one is called Watch. This one primarily looks for people who are deeply envious and bitter. It tells them that it can help them discover the secret to a happy life. And all it needs the host to do is follow people and gather observational data. Once inside, it'll spin all sorts of elaborate stories about how success is unfair, and not everybody gets to learn the secrets. It pushes the delusion that the host is somehow missing something that other people already know. And it persuades them to pick somebody, usually a person the host is already envious of, and then follow that person around constantly. It convinces the host to allow it to surface because it can keep the host safe from retaliation by those perceived to be more successful. The ability it offers is almost complete invisibility, and I say almost because it only renders the host themselves invisible. The entity's facial pattern and the black mist on the face, those remain visible. Watch guides its host into stalking someone, at first from far away. The victim will see the entity's face randomly in the distance, and over time, they will see the face closer and closer. Watch tells the host that this is an important process, because only once the successful have been driven mad will they spill the secrets of happiness. It manipulates the host into tormenting this other victim, making them paranoid. Since Watch can just go dormant and its host will look normal again, it can vanish amongst crowds and seemingly appear anywhere. This naturally makes the victim sound insane if they ever try to explain it to people, and it destroys the victim's relationships and self-confidence. Watch pushes onward until the victim is driven to the brink of insanity, because it feeds off of the paranoia and anger created by long-term psychological torture. It will keep going until the host dies somehow, either because they end up murdered by the victim, or a police standoff, or whatever. If the first victim doesn't attack the host, then it'll move on to another victim and claim that the last person must not have been successful enough to know the secrets. The cycle continues until something breaks and the host ends up dead, basically. Okay, I lied. That wasn't much lighter at all, actually. These examples are meant to show how flexible the idea can be, and how you can make it fit different genres. Jaws could fit into something focused on action. Dawn might be good for a tragedy. and watch could fit classic psychological horror. They all operate on the same system, but they're uniquely terrible in how they act. As all these ideas are public domain, you can use my examples or make your own, or change mine into your own. Either way, the overall concept is to create something that preys on a human vulnerability and uses it against us. This highlights the flaws in our thinking and shows us how easy it is to fall into these kinds of traps if we were in similar positions to these people. Of course, you could take it any direction you want. That's just how I see it. I've been calling these things entities for this entire video, but I honestly don't have any better name for them. I know in one short piece I wrote a while ago, I called them demons, but that doesn't feel right. Entities sounds a bit clinical, but I can't think of anything better. I've never been that good with naming things anyways, so call them whatever you want. It doesn't really matter what they're called. You know, this started as just a cool visual idea with the faces. I combined it with special powers, because of course I did. Then I wondered how it might make the most sense, and this is what I ended up with. Creativity is quite unusual indeed.